Margaret Hale learned very early on how to appear certain even when she was anything but. On the morning she accepted Thomas Whitmore's proposal, Boston was wrapped in one of those deceptive autumn days, blue sky, clean air, sunlight sharp enough to make everything look intentional. The kind of day that suggested clarity. Margaret took it as a sign, or at least pretended to. She stood alone in her apartment kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, staring at her phone where Thomas's name hovered above an unread message. "I hope today makes things clear for you," he had written the night before. No heart emoji, no softness, just expectation. Margaret poured herself coffee she wouldn't finish and thought, uninvited, of Julian. Julian Ross would have laughed at mornings like this. He used to say autumn in the city smelled like unfinished conversations and missed chances. He believed in metaphors the way other people believed in mortgages. He believed in her. They had met 8 years earlier in a cramped lecture hall at NYU, both pretending to take notes while secretly watching each other. Julian with his restless hands and worn leather jacket, Margaret with her careful posture, already trained to be impressive. Loving him had felt like stepping off a ledge. Terrifying, exhilarating, alive. But love didn't pay student loans. Love didn't reassure parents who measured success in titles and zip codes. Love didn't promise predictability. Thomas did. Thomas Whitmore was stability incarnate, a junior partner at a prestigious law firm, family connections that opened doors silently, a future that arrived already assembled. Being with him felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of emotional freefall. When Thomas proposed, it wasn't dramatic. No public spectacle, no trembling voice, just a quiet dinner at a refined restaurant overlooking the Charles River. He slid the ring across the table with calm confidence, as if the answer were already decided. Margaret had smiled. She always did. Yes, she said, because no felt irresponsible. Julian found out 2 weeks later. He didn't beg. That was the cruelest part. He just looked at her as if something essential had been misplaced. "You chose the life that won't scare you," he said quietly, standing in the doorway of her apartment. "I can't fault you for that. I just wish you'd admit it." She wanted to say that she was scared all the time, that choosing Thomas didn't make her brave, it made her numb. But Julian was already stepping back, already teaching himself how to let go. Marriage changed Margaret in ways no one warned her about. She learned how to host without revealing anything, how to smile through conversations that skimmed the surface of everything meaningful. Thomas was polite, dependable, admired. He never raised his voice. He never asked difficult questions either. At night, they lay beside each other like two parallel lives sharing a mattress. Margaret told herself this was adulthood. This was what winning looked like. Years passed. A house in Brookline, 2 children, a carefully curated presence on social media, family photos, charity events, vacations that looked restful but never were. She became someone people envied. And yet sometimes, alone in the kitchen long after everyone else slept, she felt an ache that had no language. It wasn't that she didn't love her children. She did, fiercely. It wasn't that Thomas was cruel. He wasn't. It was that somewhere along the way, Margaret had stopped being seen. The day Julian returned to her life, it was through an article shared by a mutual acquaintance online. Award-winning documentary filmmaker explores American displacement. There was his name beneath the headline, followed by a photo that made her breath catch. He looked older, calmer, still unmistakably Julian. Margaret stared at the screen longer than she should have, a quiet panic spreading through her chest. She told herself it meant nothing, that the past stayed where it belonged. But some choices don't stay buried. They wait. Margaret Hale learned how to move through rooms the way water does without resistance, without leaving evidence of impact. The Whitmore house in Brookline was designed for admiration. Tall windows, white trim, neutral tones that whispered restraint rather than excess. Everything inside it suggested balance. The abstract art Thomas had chosen with a consultant, the furniture arranged for conversation rather than comfort, the dining table long enough to host people who mattered. On Thursday evenings, Margaret hosted dinners. They were never loud, never messy. The kind of gatherings where laughter arrived on cue and everyone left at a reasonable hour, impressed but untouched. Thomas's colleagues from the firm, their spouses, occasionally a client whose name carried weight. Wine that was expensive enough to be noticed, but not discussed. Margaret wore dresses that fit her perfectly and revealed nothing. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with practiced ease, refilling glasses before they emptied, anticipating needs before they were voiced. People often told her she had a gift for making others feel comfortable. What they didn't know was how much effort it took not to disappear entirely. "Your home is beautiful," one of the women said that night, her smile wide, eyes scanning the room. "You're so lucky, Margaret. You really did everything right." Margaret smiled back. "We're very fortunate," she replied, because I would have sounded indulgent. Thomas sat at the head of the table, posture straight, jacket off, sleeves rolled with casual intention. He spoke easily about a case he was leading, the kind involving corporate ethics that made headlines but rarely changed outcomes. The men listened, the women nodded politely. Margaret watched him as if from a distance. She remembered a time when men talked to her, not around her. After dinner, once the guests were gone and the house returned to silence, Margaret loaded the dishwasher alone. Thomas retreated to his office upstairs, already half absorbed by emails that couldn't wait until morning. They rarely discussed this division of labor. It had simply happened, like erosion. The house hummed softly, appliances settling, the distant sound of traffic. Margaret leaned against the counter, letting the quiet stretch. This was the life she had chosen. In the mornings, she woke before everyone else. Coffee, emails, school schedules, reminders. Her children, bright, polite, impeccably dressed, kissed her cheek on their way out the door, already halfway somewhere else. Thomas left shortly after, tie perfectly knotted, briefcase in hand. "You're amazing," he said once, distracted as he reached for his keys. "I don't know how you do it all." Margaret didn't answer. She never knew what it referred to. She volunteered at the museum twice a week, chaired a fundraising committee, attended yoga classes where women whispered about private schools and property taxes. She knew which opinions were safe and which ones required softening. She had mastered the art of agreement without commitment. Online, her life looked enviable. Photos from charity galas, family vacations in Maine, a smiling anniversary post once a year, short, tasteful, sufficient. Comments flooded in. "Goals, you're glowing, so inspiring." Margaret sometimes stared at her own images, searching for herself the way one might search for a stranger in a crowd. At night, lying beside Thomas, she counted the space between them. It wasn't physical. Their bodies were close enough. It was something quieter, a lack of curiosity, a silence that no longer asked to be filled. They spoke about logistics, children, schedules, finances, rarely about fear, never about longing. Once, during a rare moment of honesty she hadn't planned, Margaret said, "Do you ever feel like we're performing our lives?" Thomas turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," he said. "It doesn't mean anything's wrong." He kissed her forehead, already retreating. Margaret lay awake long after he slept, staring at the ceiling, wondering when she had learned to doubt her own discomfort. The dissatisfaction wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive as tears or arguments. It arrived as dullness, as the slow fading of color, as the absence of questions no one thought to ask. Sometimes, alone in the car, she turned the radio off and let silence fill the space. Other times, she scrolled mindlessly through her phone, pausing on images of people who looked unburdened, who seemed to exist without calculation. And then, one afternoon, it happened. She was sitting in a cafe near the museum, waiting for a meeting that had been rescheduled without telling her. The place smelled of roasted beans and rain-soaked coats. Margaret ordered tea she didn't want and checked her phone out of habit. A name appeared on her screen. Julian Ross. Not a message, a notification. Someone had tagged him in a photo from a film festival in New York. He was standing under harsh lights, eyes serious, smile restrained. The caption read, "Couldn't have done this without you." Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. She told herself to keep scrolling, to dismiss it as coincidence. But she didn't. She tapped his profile. There wasn't much. No family photos, no curated perfection. Just fragments, projects, places, glimpses of a life that looked intentional in a way hers no longer did. He looked older, yes, but also grounded, as if he had paid for his choices and survived them. A feeling rose in her chest that frightened her with its clarity. It wasn't regret, it was recognition. Margaret locked her phone and stared out the cafe window, watching people hurry past, lives intersecting for seconds before moving on. She felt, suddenly, the full weight of the years she had spent convincing herself that safety was the same as fulfillment. That night, as she hosted another flawless dinner, laughed at the right moments, and watched Thomas command the room with effortless authority, Margaret understood something she had been avoiding for a long time. Her life was perfect, and she was unbearably alone inside it. There was no single moment Margaret could point to and say, "This is when it began to fall apart." That was the most disorienting part. No slammed doors, no shouting matches, no betrayal dramatic enough to justify anger. What happened to her marriage happened quietly, in the spaces where something should have been, but wasn't. Absence had a way of disguising itself as peace. Thomas was home less as the years passed, though not in any way that invited accusation. He left early, returned late, always with a reason that sounded reasonable. A client dinner, a conference call that ran long, a case that required attention. He never smelled like perfume, never guarded his phone, never lied outright. And yet, Margaret felt him receding, like a shoreline slowly pulling away from the water. At first, she compensated. She asked about his day with genuine interest, listened carefully, remembered names and details that mattered to him. She adjusted her schedule to align with his, cooked meals he liked even when he ate them distractedly, answering emails between bites. When he canceled plans, she smiled and said she understood. Understanding became her default posture. Over time, she learned which questions led nowhere and stopped asking them. Learned which thoughts were better kept private. Learned how to swallow disappointment so completely that it barely registered as pain anymore, just a faint pressure behind the ribs. Thomas never noticed the shift. Or perhaps he did and accepted it as efficiency. They became partners in logistics rather than intimacy. Conversations narrowed to what was necessary: children, repairs, calendars, decisions that required consensus but not vulnerability. At night, Thomas fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady, his body turned slightly away from hers. Margaret lay awake beside him, staring into the dark, replaying conversations that never happened. Arguments she never started, confessions she never made. She told herself this was what marriage looked like after romance matured. Still, there were moments, small, treacherous ones, when longing slipped through. Once, during a fundraiser at the museum, she watched a couple standing too close, their heads bent together as if the room belonged only to them. The man brushed his thumb against the woman's wrist, an unconscious gesture, intimate and unnecessary. Margaret felt something twist inside her, sharp and unexpected. She looked away immediately, ashamed of the intensity of her reaction. Guilt followed longing everywhere now. Guilt for wanting more than she had chosen. Guilt for imagining a different life when she had one others admired. Guilt for the fleeting thoughts of Julian that surfaced without warning, usually late at night, or during moments of stillness. She never searched his name again. That was the rule she imposed on herself. One look had been a lapse. Anything more would be betrayal. But memory didn't require permission. Julian lived in her recollections the way music does, appearing uninvited, fading slowly, leaving residue behind. She remembered the way he listened, really listened, as if her thoughts mattered simply because they were hers. The way silence with him felt shared rather than empty. Margaret hated herself for these comparisons. Thomas didn't deserve them. He had given her a good life, a safe one. That had to count for something. Normalization crept in quietly. It became normal that Thomas didn't notice when she cut her hair. Normal that he forgot dates that weren't work-related. Normal that her emotional life existed entirely outside their marriage, contained and invisible. Once, after a long day, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I feel lonely sometimes." Thomas looked up from his phone, genuinely puzzled. "You're not alone," he said. "You have everything." That was the end of the conversation. Margaret nodded because arguing with that statement felt ungrateful, because she lacked the vocabulary to explain the difference between presence and connection. She began to withdraw in ways that were subtle enough to escape notice. She stopped sharing her inner life, stopped hoping he would ask. She filled her time with obligations and distractions, keeping herself too busy to feel the full weight of what was missing. And yet, the erosion continued. It showed up in the way she hesitated before speaking, unsure whether her thoughts were worth voicing. In the way she checked her phone reflexively, even when there were no new messages. In the way she sometimes sat in her car after pulling into the driveway, engine off, gathering the energy to go inside. She became adept at minimizing herself. Margaret told herself she was strong for enduring this quietly, mature, reasonable. She told herself that wanting more was childish, even dangerous, that stability required sacrifice, that this was the price. But late at night, when sleep refused to come, another truth pressed against her ribs. She wasn't sacrificing for something. She was sacrificing herself. The realization terrified her, because if the problem wasn't dramatic, if it was simply absence, then there was nothing to fight. No villain to confront, no clear reason to leave. Just a slow, invisible loss. And Margaret had no idea how much she had already given up, until the day her phone vibrated with a message she wasn't expecting, a name she had trained herself not to look for. Julian Ross. No subject line, no preamble, just one sentence. "I didn't know if I should write, but I'm in Boston, and I thought of you." Margaret stared at the screen, her breath shallow, her hands cold. The erosion stopped in that instant, not because it healed, but because it was finally exposed. And she understood, with sudden, aching clarity, that what she had buried for years was not dead. It had only been waiting. Margaret read Julian's message 3 times before she allowed herself to breathe. "I'm in Boston." As if the city hadn't already been full of ghosts. She didn't reply immediately. That was the first instinct: delay, distance, control. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and busied herself with meaningless tasks. Wiping a surface already clean, aligning the mail into neat piles, refilling a glass of water she hadn't finished. Her heart beat too loudly in her ears, an adolescent rhythm she resented. This was dangerous. Not because of what Julian might do, but because of what he represented. Thomas was still at work. The children were at after-school activities. The house was quiet in the particular way that magnified thoughts instead of calming them. Margaret sat at the dining table and finally turned her phone back over. She typed, erased, retyped. "I didn't expect to hear from you." Delete. "How long are you here?" Too eager. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Finally she wrote, "I hope you're well. Boston can be unkind this time of year." It was safe, polite, useless. His response came quickly. "I remember. Coffee?" No expectations. No expectations was a lie they both understood. They met 2 days later, in the same cafe near the museum where Margaret had first seen his face again, an unintentional symmetry that made her stomach tighten. She arrived early, chose a table near the window, and spent several minutes pretending to read emails while scanning every reflection. When Julian walked in, she recognized him instantly, and still, the sight of him struck like a physical blow. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had grown smaller. His hair was shorter, threaded with early gray. His face held lines that hadn't been there before, not from age alone, but from endurance. He looked like a man who had learned how to carry disappointment without letting it hollow him out. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Julian smiled, not wide, not careless, but real. The kind of smile that acknowledged history rather than pretending it didn't exist. "Margaret," he said, her name familiar in his mouth in a way that felt almost intimate. "Julian." Her voice held, barely. They embraced, briefly, awkwardly, no lingering, no pretense. When they pulled apart, something fragile hovered between them, unnamed. He sat across from her, wrapping his hands around his coffee as if grounding himself. "You look... well," she smiled, reflexive. So do you. Congratulations on the film. I read about it. I didn't know you followed my work, he said lightly, though his eyes sharpened with curiosity. I don't, she replied honestly. It found me. That earned a small laugh from him, then a pause. Silence settled, thick but not uncomfortable. It felt earned. They spoke at first of neutral things, the city, the weather, his time in California, her children. He listened carefully, the way he always had, asking questions that suggested he wanted more than the surface version. You seem tired, he said finally, not unkindly. Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. That's what happens when you have a full life. Julian studied her, something unreadable in his gaze. Is it? The question landed softly and devastatingly. She looked away, toward the window, watching pedestrians blur past. You didn't come back just to comment on my energy levels. No, he admitted. I didn't. Another silence, this one heavier. I wasn't sure I should reach out, Julian continued, but I kept thinking if I didn't, I'd regret it. And I've had enough of that. Margaret's chest tightened. Regret was a word she lived with, but never spoke aloud. I heard you married, he said, gently, as if confirming something he already knew. A lawyer? She nodded. Thomas, yes. Are you happy? There it was, the question no one else asked. The one Thomas assumed unnecessary. Margaret hesitated. The honest answer hovered, dangerous and liberating all at once. I'm functioning, she said finally. Julian didn't smile. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze then, fully. Some questions don't have clean answers. He leaned back slightly, exhaling. You always were good at making things sound reasonable. There was no accusation in his tone, just memory. They spoke then of the past, not in detail, but in impressions. The choices they made, the cities they lived in, the people they became. Julian talked about his work, the years it took to be taken seriously, the relationships that failed because he had been unavailable in different ways. I was angry for a long time, he said quietly, at you, at myself, at the world for pretending love wasn't enough. Margaret swallowed. And now? And now I understand why you chose what you did, he said. I just don't understand why it still hurts. The words pierced her with surgical precision. It hurts, she said, voice barely above a whisper, because I never stopped wondering who I would have been if I'd chosen differently. Julian looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch. So did I. They left the cafe together but parted at the corner, instinctively. No plans made, no promises implied. Still, as Margaret walked away, she felt something she hadn't in years. Awake. That night, lying beside Thomas as he slept, she stared into the darkness and replayed every word, every glance. Guilt washed over her in waves, not because she had done something wrong, but because she wanted something she had already surrendered. Julian's return hadn't given her answers. It had stripped away her defenses, and beneath them, she found truths she could no longer ignore. Margaret did not tell herself she was crossing a line. That was the lie she needed most. Instead, she framed it differently. We're just talking. This is harmless. Nothing physical has happened. The words arranged themselves neatly in her mind, forming a structure she could live inside without confronting the truth pressing against its walls. Julian texted occasionally, never late at night, never with urgency, short messages that carried no demands. I'm walking the common, forgot how quiet it can feel. Saw a bookstore I think you'd like. Do you still drink your coffee too slowly? Margaret replied with the same restraint, the same measured tone she used in every other corner of her life. But the effect was different. With Julian, even the smallest exchange felt charged, as if meaning hid between the words rather than inside them. They met again, then again. Always in public. Cafes, museum steps, park benches where distance could be maintained without comment. They never touched beyond brief greetings. No hands brushing accidentally, no excuses made. And yet, something intimate unfolded all the same. Julian remembered her, not the version she had become, but the one she had been. He asked about her thoughts, not her schedule. He noticed when she hesitated, when she deflected. He listened in a way that required nothing in return. You don't talk about yourself the way you used to, he said once as they walked side by side along the river. Margaret smiled faintly. People change. Yes, he agreed, but they don't usually disappear. The observation lingered with her long after they parted. At home, Margaret moved through her days with increasing detachment. The routines remained, meals, meetings, obligations, but they felt hollow now, like rehearsals for a life she no longer believed in. Thomas was as he always had been, efficient, focused, distant in ways that no longer surprised her. When he spoke, she answered. When he asked, she responded. But she had stopped offering herself unprompted. Her emotional life had shifted elsewhere. At night, after everyone slept, Margaret reread old messages from Julian. Not from the past, but from now. She replayed their conversations, the moments when he had seen through her carefully constructed calm. She told herself she wasn't comparing, but she was. The past, filtered through memory and sharpened by absence, began to feel more vivid than her present. With Julian, everything had texture. Even silence felt shared. With Thomas, silence was simply the absence of sound. Guilt followed her everywhere. It settled in her chest when she laughed at something Julian said and realized she hadn't laughed that way at home in years. It crept in when she caught herself thinking of him first, before her husband, when something meaningful happened. She began to guard her phone more carefully. Not out of fear of discovery, Thomas rarely noticed such things, but out of a growing awareness that what she was doing mattered. This wasn't an affair in the way people recognized. It was something quieter, more dangerous. One afternoon, they sat across from each other in a nearly empty cafe, rain streaking the windows. Julian spoke about a relationship that had ended years earlier. His voice even, but weighted. I loved her, he said, but I was never fully there. I was still somewhere else. Margaret knew what he meant without asking. Did you ever stop being angry at me? She asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could reconsider. Julian looked at her for a long moment. I stopped being angry, he said. I never stopped being hurt. The honesty cut deeper than accusation. I'm sorry, she whispered. The words felt insufficient, but they were all she had. So am I, he replied, for making it feel like love should have been enough. It wasn't fair to ask you to gamble your life on me. Margaret shook her head slowly. I didn't choose stability because you asked too much, she said. I chose it because I was afraid. Of me? Of myself, she answered. Something shifted then. Not desire exactly, but recognition. The shared understanding of two people who had grown into the consequences of their choices. They didn't speak for a while after that. When Julian reached across the table, it was only to slide a napkin toward her. She hadn't realized she was crying. That night, Thomas asked, You seem distracted lately. Everything okay? Margaret nodded. Just tired. The lie came easily. Too easily. Later, alone in bed, she stared at the ceiling and acknowledged what she had been avoiding. She was already unfaithful, not in body, but in truth. Her deepest thoughts, her fears, her longings existed outside her marriage now. She was sharing herself with someone else, and it felt like oxygen. Julian never pressured her, never suggested anything beyond what they already had. That restraint made everything sharper, more intense. It kept the line visible even as they walked dangerously close to it. This isn't fair to you, Margaret said once, her voice tight. I'm married. I know, Julian replied, and I'm not asking you to leave. That doesn't make it better. No, he agreed, it just makes it honest. The word stayed with her. Honest. Her life had been built on reasonable compromises, on choices that looked correct from the outside. But this emotional intimacy she was cultivating in secret felt truer than anything she had allowed herself in years. That truth frightened her, because she knew it couldn't last, because she knew it would demand something from her eventually, and because, for the first time in a long while, Margaret understood that the most devastating betrayals didn't always involve touch. Sometimes they lived entirely in the heart, quiet, invisible, and impossible to undo. Margaret had always believed that if she were careful enough, quiet enough, nothing would spill. That belief unraveled slowly through details too small to defend against. It began with something trivial, a notification Thomas glanced at while her phone lay face up on the kitchen counter. He hadn't been snooping. That was the cruel irony. He was looking for a recipe Margaret had saved for dinner. Julian's name appeared briefly at the top of the screen before she reached for the phone. Thomas didn't say anything, not then, but something shifted. He grew observant in a way he never had before, not suspicious exactly, just present. He noticed when Margaret smiled faintly at messages she didn't explain, when she lingered too long in the car after errands, when her attention drifted as if part of her were elsewhere. "You've been busy lately," he remarked one evening, tone neutral. "Yes," she replied, just as neutrally. That was how these things worked now. Observation without confrontation, distance without accusation. The second fracture came through social media. Margaret didn't realize how visible patterns could be until they were reflected back at her. A colleague casually mentioned a documentary screening Julian had attended in Boston weeks earlier. Someone tagged Margaret in a photo from the museum fundraiser the same night Julian had posted a quiet image from a nearby bar. The caption vague but familiar. Coincidence, perhaps. Except coincidence required plausible deniability, and Margaret was running out of that. She and Julian began to space out their meetings, sensing the tightening air without naming it. Fewer messages, longer pauses. But absence now hurt more sharply than presence ever had. One afternoon, they crossed paths unexpectedly, truly unexpectedly outside a small bookstore in Cambridge. Margaret froze when she saw him, caught mid-step, her heart lurching. Julian smiled, surprised. "I wasn't sure you'd still come here." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. They spoke briefly, awkwardly, both aware of how exposed they were in the open street. When they parted, Margaret felt eyes on her, not literally, but socially, as if the city itself were beginning to notice. That evening, Thomas finally spoke. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked calmly, as they sat across from each other at the dining table. No anger, no raised voice, just a question laid bare. Margaret's breath caught. "What?" "You've been elsewhere," he said, emotionally, "for a while now." She stared at him, stunned not by the question, but by the accuracy. Thomas had never been this perceptive before. Or perhaps he always had been, and she had mistaken silence for ignorance. "There's no affair," she said quickly. Thomas nodded. "That's not what I asked." The truth pressed against her throat, heavy and insistent. "There's someone from my past," she said finally. "We've talked, that's all." Thomas leaned back slightly, studying her as if recalibrating a familiar equation. "And you didn't think that mattered?" "It didn't feel like it at first," she whispered. "Does it now?" Margaret looked down at her hands, at the faint indentation where her wedding ring rested. "Yes." The room fell silent. "This," Thomas said slowly, "is what betrayal looks like for you?" The question wasn't cruel, it was wounded. "I never touched him," Margaret said, as if that were a defense. Thomas exhaled. "You don't have to," he replied. "You've already left." The words struck with brutal clarity. For the first time, Margaret saw the consequences of what she had been doing, not abstract, not theoretical, but real. She had displaced her husband without ever leaving the house. She had given her inner life to someone else and called it restraint. Guilt rose fully now, no longer manageable. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears blurring her vision. "That doesn't change that it did," Thomas replied. "I trusted that if something was wrong, you'd tell me." Margaret had no answer. She had mistaken endurance for honesty, silence for loyalty. In the days that followed, the tension settled into the house like fog. Thomas withdrew not dramatically, but decisively. Polite, distant, present only where necessary. Margaret felt the weight of what she had jeopardized with every shared space. Julian sensed it too. "I think this has gone far enough," Margaret said during their last meeting, her voice steady but hollow. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't have consequences." Julian nodded, pain flickering briefly across his face. "I understand." They stood there, facing each other, aware that this ending hurt precisely because nothing tangible had ever begun. "This was never just memory," he said quietly. "It mattered." "I know," she replied. "That's why it has to stop." They parted without promises, without closure. At home, Margaret faced what remained. Thomas didn't demand explanations. He didn't issue ultimatums. His restraint was almost unbearable. It forced her to sit with her choices, with the realization that emotional infidelity left damage no less real for being invisible. For the first time, Margaret understood the full cost of the life she had constructed. Not safety, distance. And now, exposure. Reckoning did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It arrived as clarity. Margaret noticed it one morning while standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth beside Thomas in silence. The reflections shared the same space, yet felt oddly unrelated, two people performing the choreography of intimacy without its substance. She realized then that the choice she had been postponing was already demanding payment. Preserving the life she had built meant continuing a version of herself that no longer existed. Embracing honesty meant dismantling everything that made her feel acceptable, admired, safe. Neither path offered mercy. Thomas did not rush her. That was his quiet power. He went about his days with deliberate calm, his politeness now edged with formality. He slept in the guest room without discussion. The children noticed, of course they always did, but he framed it as temporary professional stress. Margaret watched him from a distance, struck by the irony. This was the most emotionally present he had ever been. Not affectionate, but attentive, as if the possibility of losing her had finally forced him to look directly at her. "You seem resolved," he said one evening as they sat across from each other in the living room. No television, no phones, just space. "I'm trying to be honest," she replied. "With me," he clarified, "or with yourself?" The question landed cleanly. "Precisely. I don't know if I can do both," Margaret admitted. Thomas nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of." She told him then not everything, but enough. About the loneliness that had preceded Julian. About the way absence had hollowed her out long before another man ever entered her emotional life. She spoke carefully, not to accuse, but to explain. Thomas listened without interruption. His face gave little away. "When did you stop choosing us?" he asked quietly. Margaret closed her eyes. "I don't think I ever stopped," she said. "I just didn't know how to choose myself without losing everything else." Silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. "I built this life because I thought it would protect me," she continued. "And it did. From fear, from instability, from failure. But it also protected me from being fully alive." Thomas leaned back, exhaustion etched into his expression. "And now? Now I can't unsee it." That night, Margaret lay awake alone, considering the brutal symmetry of her life. Years ago, she had chosen stability over love. Now she was being asked to choose truth over comfort. Julian's absence pressed against her thoughts, not as temptation, but as mirror. He was no longer the question. He had simply revealed one. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret began therapy, alone. She stopped pretending she was fine. She allowed herself to say words she had avoided for decades. Resentment, regret, fear. Naming them didn't solve anything, but it stripped them of their quiet power. One afternoon, Thomas said, "I don't want a marriage where I'm chosen by default." Neither did she. The decision, when it came, was almost calm. Margaret chose honesty not because it promised happiness, but because continuing the lie felt like erasure. They decided to separate. Not dramatically, no lawyers at first, just acknowledgement. A mutual understanding that what they had was real, meaningful, and no longer sufficient. Thomas moved into a small apartment nearby. The children were told gently, carefully, with reassurances that didn't fully reassure anyone. Margaret watched the life she had curated loosen its grip on her reputation. Whispers followed. Questions formed behind polite smiles. Some friends drifted away, uncomfortable with complexity. Stability had protected her once. Now it abandoned her. Julian did not reappear to rescue her from the fallout. He respected the distance she had drawn. That, too, was a kind of love, one that refused to become an escape. Margaret stood alone in the quiet of her half-empty house one evening, surrounded by the evidence of a choice that promised no redemption arc, only consequence. She felt grief for the marriage that failed not from cruelty, but from neglect. For the woman she had been when she believed safety was enough. For the years she would never reclaim. And yet, beneath it all, something steadier emerged. Ownership. For the first time in her life, Margaret was not living the correct story. She was living the true one, even if it hurt. Margaret Hale learned, eventually, how to live with echoes. Years passed, not quickly, not kindly, but steadily, like water reshaping stone. Time did not heal everything, as people like to claim. It clarified. It separated what could be carried from what had to be laid down. She lived alone now in a smaller townhouse closer to the city, its imperfections oddly comforting. The rooms bore marks of actual use. Books left open, mugs forgotten on side tables, silence that belonged only to her. Her children visited on scheduled days, older now, observant in ways that unsettled her. They asked fewer questions, but their eyes held more understanding than she was ready for. Thomas had remarried. Margaret heard about it through a mutual friend, then saw it confirmed online. A tasteful photo, a caption that suggested renewal without explanation. She studied the image longer than she intended to. He looked older, softer somehow, happier perhaps, in a way that didn't require distance. The realization hurt more than she expected, not because she wanted him back, but because it confirmed something she had already known. What they had lacked together, he was capable of offering elsewhere. Julian, on the other hand, had faded into something quieter. They never rekindled anything dramatic. No reunion, no second chance framed as destiny. There were occasional updates, indirect, through articles, through whispers of shared acquaintances. His work grew more acclaimed, his presence more contained. Once, years later, she ran into him at an airport lounge in Chicago. They spoke briefly, politely, warmly. There was affection there, unmistakable and restrained. There was also acceptance. "I'm glad you chose yourself," he said, simply. Margaret smiled. "I wish I'd known how earlier." "So do I," he replied, and meant something different. They parted without regret, but not without cost. Now, in her early 50s, Margaret often walked the city alone. She had learned to enjoy her own company, to sit with discomfort rather than anesthetize it. Therapy had helped. So had writing private journals no one would read, filled with questions she no longer avoided. Sometimes, late in the evening, she allowed herself to remember, not nostalgically, precisely. She remembered the woman she had been at 28, standing at a crossroads, terrified of instability, convinced that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. She remembered how society had nodded approvingly when she chose correctly, how no one had warned her that safety could become a slow kind of grief. Stability had given her structure, protection, a life that looked successful from the outside, but it had demanded silence in return. Margaret understood now that love was not something you postponed and later retrieved intact. It was something that required risk in real time, or it hardened into memory. She had paid for her choices not in one devastating moment, but in increments, in quiet dinners, in conversations that never deepened, in years spent believing that endurance was the same as virtue. Did she regret her life? The answer was complicated. She did not regret her children. She did not regret surviving her fears. She did not regret choosing stability when she lacked the tools to choose otherwise. But she mourned the version of herself who had believed that safety and fulfillment were interchangeable. That woman had been wrong. On some evenings, Margaret sat by her window and watched the city glow into night. Office lights blinking out one by one, couples passing on the sidewalk below, lives intersecting briefly before diverging again. She no longer felt the sharp ache of longing. What remained was something steadier, heavier, understanding. She had chosen stability over love, and stability had done exactly what it promised. It kept her safe. But love, true, consuming, inconvenient love had been the price, not stolen from her, given up. Margaret did not tell this story as a warning. Life, she had learned, did not unfold in lessons clean enough to teach. It unfolded in choices that made sense at the time and revealed their meaning only later. All she could do now was live honestly with the cost. And in that honesty, quiet, uncelebrated, deeply earned, she finally felt something close to peace.